afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us after lunch and after the next sessions. My name is Keren Skubach. I'm a senior sales engineer from InterSystems Israel. With me are two of my colleagues, which I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you. I'm Vixon, a sales engineer here in North America.
And I'm Steve Mallam. I manage the healthcare sales engineering team in the UK. That is a good start. Yeah. What we're going to talk about is Keren's going to start by talking about experiences of delivering FHIR projects in Israel. And then Vic is going to talk about experiences with startups here in the US. And then I'm going to talk about use cases and projects we've done in the UK. So, Keren?
Yeah. Well, first of all, when we think about FHIR as a standard, usually we think about the repository, how we keep all the information in a FHIR repository. But we need to think about the fact that it's also a data flow. Okay, so you move the information as FHIR back and forth. Okay, either getting information or posting information. And when you think about getting all your information in a FHIR repository, okay, this is not the only goal. You can still participate in the FHIR game without keeping the information in a FHIR repository. Okay, and based on projects that we've done in Israel, there are a lot of things that you can do in order to be part of the FHIR ecosystem, even without keeping the information as FHIR, which is quite a daunting task when you say to your organization, okay, let's have another database, keep the information in a different format that nobody ever heard about, okay, and let's start synchronizing everything with that repository. Okay, so we need to think about other options apart from using that repository. Another thing we should look about is when we think about the FHIR project, first of all, there needs to be knowledge. And the learning curve is pretty steep, especially when you start on your first FHIR project, okay? Because it looks nice, it looks like JSON, okay? Everybody can know JSON, but then you delve in and you understand there's a big complexity about understanding what's inside, what you should keep, how you use the same terminology, what resources you want to implement, how do you connect between one another, how would you handle bundles, and so forth. Okay, so the knowledge needs to be in the organization, but it doesn't have to be as big from day one. Okay, so you can start small, and I will give you some example on how to start and how to build your confidence with FHIR projects, especially if you have the first one. The second thing is time. The first project is going to be more time-consuming than others, okay? First of all, because of the learning curve, but then again, because you need to understand how to keep the information, how to move the information, what are the repercussions of moving that information in a FHIR standard. And then you'll need a budget, okay? Most of the first projects would be more budget-oriented, okay? You need to invest something in the understanding of what you're doing with FHIR, and of course, there's a risk. Okay, the longer you have more and more projects in FHIR, the risk is going to get lower. Okay, the first ones are riskier than the others. Okay, it's a new thing you need to implement in your organization, and not everybody has the concept of how to use it. And if we look at the curve of things that are being implemented in FHIR, you can start small. You can be a FHIR client, meaning you just send the information as FHIR and receive the information in FHIR, and you don't keep it as FHIR. Okay, so you don't need a FHIR repository. You can still be in the FHIR ecosystem, but be a client. Just start to understand the concept on how to work with FHIR. The second thing you can do if you're already a FHIR client is maybe be in the game as a FHIR Façade, meaning someone would access you in a FHIR request, and you would give them a FHIR response, but you would not keep that information. Okay, you would transform it to another format, go to other databases you have in your organization or other systems that has the information over there, okay? But you're still going to communicate with FHIR, and along the way, you would understand how to work with it, okay? So you would gain knowledge and understand which resources you want to use, okay? If you want to keep them, how would you keep them? What information would you like to keep in each one of those resources? Once you would be a FHIR Façade, you might say, well, I'm already returning a FHIR resource. I might as well keep it in addition, okay? So I'm going to my backend system, getting the information, transforming it to FHIR, and just before I'm sending it back to the caller, I'm going to keep it in a FHIR repository just on the way, Okay, I will learn some things out of that if I'm keeping it according to the standard, what information do I want to keep in it, and so forth. And then we have the FHIR repository. Okay, so you can go along the way. Nobody say you have to go along the way, but you can start small and build your confidence from one project to another until you will go to that FHIR repository place. And just as a note, the FHIR repository is not the end of the game. Okay, we have some things to do after you have a FHIR repository. And if you look at the projects that were done in Israel, there are several ones. Some of the organizations are being in that FHIR ecosystem in different roles. Some would be a repository, some would be a facade, some would be a client, and some would be a combination of a couple of those roles, okay? So you don't need to have one single job when you speak about FHIR. Not everybody is gonna do the same in this FHIR game, okay? So you decide what kind of things you wanna do inside. And basically what we found out is that the type of the organization is basically gonna define the needs on how to play with FHIR. Okay, so if you're a startup and you don't have any other databases, you can start with the FHIR repository. This is the only database you have, so why not start keeping the data as FHIR from the beginning and being that point of truth? Just start from there, that's it. You don't have any other applications to bear in mind, okay? This is the starting point. Of course, if you're a hospital or if you're a government, you already have other databases, okay? So it's a bigger decision to maintain and to decide, but you still have the power to do that, okay? So you can go along the way, start as a client or start as a facade and finish as a FHIR repository, or you can say, okay, I'm starting as a repository, but I don't have to keep everything inside, okay? Because when you think about a FHIR repository, it's quite daunting because you say, well, in the FHIR repository, I have like 170 resources. And when you start to think about each one of those resources and the complications that are within each one of those resources, it's mind-boggling, okay? Patient is quite relatively small, okay? But when you think about observations or encounters, okay, each one of them can have multi-layers of information within them, okay? Or whatever lab result, try to put it as an observation. You would have terminology, you would have a lot of things that you need to keep inside. So when you think about implementing a FHIR repository, bear in mind you don't have to implement all the resources, okay? You can decide I want to implement only the patient resource and the observation resource, or just the encounter resource, okay? And continue from there. Another aspect is the thing is you might decide to keep, I don't know, 5 resources, but they don't have to be on all the population you have. You might have an oncology project, okay? And you would keep only the population in that endpoint of the oncology patients. And you would have another project that for orthopedic or for medicine or anything else, and that endpoint will hold the information for that project, just for that, okay? So not everything needs to be in one single endpoint of a FHIR repository, okay? You can divide those into different aspects. Maybe someday you'll try to combine them, but you don't have to, which is okay, okay? So this is something you need to think about when you think about a FHIR repository. Don't put it from day one, everything in the same place, okay? You don't need to do that. Another thing is the fact that you need to design, you need to architecture, and you need to develop each one of those projects. And the bigger projects that we have now are basically projects between organizations. They're not within the organization, okay? Within your organization, probably most of the interfaces you would have now are based on other technologies, either simple REST or HL7 or anything else you have in between. And there's no reason to move them to FHIR now. First of all, because of the knowledge. Second of all, it already works, okay? Why invest the time to transform them to something else? Okay, but interfaces between organizations, if they're gonna be in a format that everybody would understand and everybody would define this is the format we're gonna use, you'll have more and more connections between organizations, and FHIR will be the common denominator for everything in it, okay? And we can see along the way that more and more organizations are getting into this game. So the longer FHIR is in your environment, it would be easier to implement more and more FHIR projects. So in the long run, we might see all our interfaces, even within the organization, based on FHIR, but this is the long run. I don't see it in the next year or two, okay? But we need to start somewhere, okay? So we would usually start with the B2B interfaces, if we'll call it like that, and later on, we'll move into the other interfaces, okay, within the organization. Remember that I said before that the FHIR repository is not the end of the game, okay? You have the information as FHIR, but you can leverage it and do analytics on it. For example, use the FHIR SQL Builder, okay, that Vic is gonna speak about later on. So you have some other things to do after you have the FHIR repository, okay? So don't look at it as the end point of using FHIR. There are other things you can do with it. And of course, FHIR has its own challenge. Okay? If you look at the challenges that most of the FHIR projects are going to encounter, it's either going to be with customization, okay, or profile validation, or terminology, okay, or all three of them together. The first one is customization, meaning there is a FHIR model, okay, and there is a FHIR standard, but each organization has their own customization to do. For example, one organization would decide that he would not allow to retrieve information about dead people, okay? He only wants to get information about specific population, okay? This is up to him. So you need to customize your basic endpoint, FHIR endpoint, to accommodate the FHIR needs of that organization. So you need to customize it, even though the standard does not say anything about something like that, okay? Whatever you have in the FHIR resource, in the FHIR repository, you can get back, right? Back and forth. If it's there, you can get it. But the organization might have their own restrictions on getting that data. So you'll need to customize it. The second thing is profile validation, okay? You have FHIR profiles, whether it's the US profile, the Israeli profile, your own organization profile, and you'll need to validate every resource going back and forth according to that profile. So this is something you need to take into consideration just to make sure that you're working on the same standard that the organization is looking for. And again, if you're communicating with other organizations that might have other profiles, you need to accommodate to that profile as well. And the third thing that I haven't met any FHIR project who hasn't encountered this kind of challenge is terminology, okay? Whether it's going to be a national terminology server, local terminology server, lookup tables, you name it. There is certain terminology you need to keep in order to work in a FHIR repository, okay? When you keep the information, and not only to keep the information, to transfer the information as well. You need to speak with the same language, with the same codes, whether those are lab tests, whether it's your insurance company, whether it's your identification for your patients and so forth. Everybody needs to speak on the same language so we can know that we're speaking about the same lab task, okay, or the same patient, or the same visit, or the same insurance code, okay? So it needs to be remembered and looked upon and think about when we design the project, because it's going to cost us in the long run once we start transferring data and they say, okay, this is a lab test that I don't have in my system. And then we have a problem, okay? Especially when money is involved and where human lives are involved in those kind of things. The last thing that we found was the fact that a lot of the organizations are looking at the cloud, which is not new, okay? And there are two options that you could look at FHIR in the cloud. The first one is get your own cloud environment and install InterSystems Iris for Health or Health Connect with a FHIR add-on in the cloud and maintain it on your own. So you can put your FHIR data in the cloud. The second option is to use our own managed FHIR, InterSystem FHIR server, where we manage your data, okay? We manage your server. You keep the data in it, but you don't have to maintain the server. We do it for you. So this is where you're going to keep your data in the cloud. But we also have a service that would help you convert your data to FHIR, okay? We have a FHIR Transformations service, which would accept your HL7 data and gives you back FHIR. Okay? And then you would decide what you want to do with that FHIR, whether keep it in the cloud, whether keep it on-prem, okay, where you send it somewhere else, whether transform it to any other kind of data you would like. Okay, so this is a service you can use in order to get your information to FHIR. I'm going to hand the mic back to Vic, who will continue to speak about his North American use of startups.
Hi, everybody. My name again is Vic Sun. I'm a sales engineer based out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. First, I want to say thank you all for your interest in the session. I'm glad we got promoted to this large stage. It comes with the fancy microphone and the screen and everything, so very excited to get to use that. To give a little bit of context on where I'm coming from and build on what Keren had already said, I work with startups, which is maybe not the market that you're most familiar of InterSystems working with. Certainly, we work with a lot of people on the enterprise side, but we are also interested in working with people who are looking to innovate, people who are looking to connect to various systems. It's not necessarily people who are going to have 50, 100 people IT teams, tons of integration expertise that they can bring to these FHIR projects that they might be taking on. So certainly we have a lot of resources available to help people as they're starting to investigate these things. Startups maybe are hearing about FHIR for the first time. Maybe they're hearing EMRs are starting to adopt FHIR. Maybe a particular client that they're looking to work with is saying, hey, we're looking to use FHIR. Or they may indeed have some integration knowledge, and they can use that, run with that, and say, hey, InterSystems, can you help me with some FHIR integration use case? So what I want to talk about is kind of into 3 silos. I want to build on what Keren was saying about some of the challenges and some of the reasons why FHIR is attractive to adopt. And I especially kind of want to narrow in on the idea that FHIR is not all or nothing, as your slide mentioned. There are ways that you can get into FHIR on more of a piecemeal basis. You can approach it with your level of expertise. You can adopt it to a narrower slice of whatever your particular use case is. Again, as she mentioned, not necessarily needing to get all the different FHIR resources, but you can pick and choose and really limit the amount of resources you need to invest into a particular project accordingly. So the first slide that I'll be going over is on the topic of FHIR accelerators. So for most of you here, I'm sure healthcare integration is not a new topic to you. Working with InterSystems integration as well, the ability to transform between different formats, this is absolutely something that is applicable to FHIR as well, in the FHIR Façade as well that Keren mentioned. And then to talk about the growth of FHIR services, which we ourselves at InterSystems are expanding quite a bit over time. And even as we speak, we're releasing more and more point services for FHIR. And as we see that adoption grow in the market and with ourselves, if you have some particular FHIR need that isn't currently addressed by a service, perhaps that need will eventually be met without you needing to do too much FHIR design yourself. The second piece I want to talk about is Smart on FHIR, which is kind of a corollary standard to FHIR. The idea is it's the extra authorization layer alongside the FHIR data type choice. And so I think tying into our already ready theme from this morning's keynote, by adopting those modern standards, the modern trappings of REST and JSON that FHIR brings, and the Smart on FHIR side of authorization with OAuth 2, you really can set yourself up to have an application that can stand the test of time and can plug into a lot of situations without too much modification because it is rooted in modern standards. And finally, as Keren introduced for me, there's the FHIR SQL Builder, which I will talk about briefly. You may or may not have had the chance to see it at my colleague Jack's demo and drink presentation yesterday, but fundamentally the idea being you can leverage FHIR data without needing to learn a bunch of new FHIR query syntax. You can use your existing SQL knowledge and say, hey, I have this FHIR data, this FHIR repository. Let me project this into a relational table format, and then I can use my standard business intelligence or SQL analytics, whatever you want to do, to make sense of that data without, again, bringing on additional FHIR developers who specialize in that kind of thing. So let's move forward. This is my kind of background slide here, as I was walking in, I heard somebody saying something along the lines of legacy HL7 is still the standard. Absolutely, it is. It is still very common. Almost everybody that I talk to about integration use cases is familiar with legacy HL7. Not necessarily everybody is familiar with FHIR, but certainly FHIR is becoming more and more adopted. I would say, at least a third of the startups I'm talking to these days have brought up FHIR in and of themselves without me bringing it to the conversation. So for these people that have smaller teams, I would say that's a pretty good uptick in FHIR entering the conversation. So absolutely, legacy HL7 still has its place. You still want your integration engines, you still want to be able to handle that kind of event-based messaging, but FHIR is being adopted, and it also is a more modern standard. So as we discussed, it being kind of REST-based, it being familiar to the JSON format, developers who aren't necessarily FHIR developers can look at it and say, this is maybe something that I can familiarize myself with and work with. Whereas if somebody looks at an HL7 message, they might have flashbacks to an older time. So I do want to talk about kind of some FHIR accelerators and some FHIR services that you can look at. So in the FHIR Façade space, certainly it can be attractive to use an integration engine to handle conversion of data between different formats, including to and from FHIR. Recently, we've released the FHIR object model. So using the same graphical DTL editor that you're familiar with, you can now map to the different FHIR resources. So that can really make it convenient in terms of converting your data from your legacy formats or your custom formats and bring it back and forth into FHIR for your usage. On the services side, I think we're probably at the point where I don't need to explain that services are appealing for a variety of reasons. It saves you a lot of effort. Don't reinvent the wheel. Let people who are experts in things build the service side of things, the backend side of things, that you can focus on your IP and focus on developing what's unique to you. And as I had already touched on, FHIR is another space where that is growing. So we're trying to release more FHIR services to make it easier for people to use FHIR data, and certainly we expect that to continue moving forward. So I don't want to talk too much about Smart on FHIR. It's a bit of a separate topic, but I do want to touch on the idea of building this kind of portable FHIR application that I think in a lot of ways the dream of a Smart on FHIR application is to say, we understand that you're going to use the FHIR data type. We understand that you're going to use OAuth2 for authorization. We understand that there's this environment context in which you can kind of drag and drop your various Smart on FHIR applications on. And if that environment respects those standards, it knows how to speak FHIR, it knows how to speak OAuth2, then you don't need to do any custom setup to say, hey, let me implement this application into my environment. So there are various places where you can build that context to run your Smart on FHIR application. As you might have seen yesterday, the clinical viewer is one such. You can also launch a Smart on FHIR application standalone. Maybe an optimistic goal for the future is that EHRs may be able to host such a Smart on FHIR application. Currently, my experience has been that for many of the same reasons that connecting with an EHR can be difficult generally in an integration sense with HL7 or whatever else, what have you, there are many business side and data quality reasons why a site or an EOR vendor may not want to make that super accessible. So we're a little ways away from that being a reality still. But again, thinking of the values of using these modern standards, you're still able to meet your modern security needs. You're still able to use a modern data standard that is going to make sense to your developers and is going to stand the test of time, that people are building services for, that people are building tools to work with. So I still think that if you're not familiar with what a Smart on FHIR application is, it's worth learning more about. And then I want to talk about the FHIR SQL Builder. So as you can see here, FHIR is a kind of an ugly format when you explode it onto a screen like this. It's pretty complex. There's a lot of different relationships. It can't be simply queried. There's a couple of different options for doing that. if you're trying to query a FHIR repository, you can learn the FHIR search parameters. There are people developing FHIR path for graph-based searching. Our approach to this has been, we know that people know relational tables. We know that people know SQL. We've created a non-duplicating way to project your data from FHIR to a relational table, and then, as I discussed, and as you may have seen in Jack's presentation, you can then query that using whatever tools you're familiar with. And so this is another way that you can really focus in on the particular aspects of FHIR that are pertinent to you, because it's not that you're looking at the whole of FHIR and saying, I want to run analytics on this. You're building your own projection on the resources and the fields that are pertinent to the types of analytics that you're looking to do. So I think this is a really cool tool that we're offering. I also want to mention that for many of the FHIR services that we're offering, or you might hear about here, please go look on the AWS Marketplace. A lot of them have free trials that you can look at yourselves, play with, test out, and get your own hands on that and see how easy it is really to pick up a FHIR service yourself. So in summary, before I pass along to Steve to bring us home, FHIR certainly is being adopted pretty heavily. It's not just something that people with massive integration teams can look at. It's something that even on smaller scales and on the startup side, it's entering the conversation from both sides, both being driven by larger hospital sites or clients, and being driven by the startups themselves. Also, FHIR doesn't need to be a scary thing. You can approach it one step at a time. It doesn't need to be a monolithic project. You can say, I have this particular FHIR use case. Let me try to implement that, and from there you can kind of expand as makes sense. And I think that also makes sense in terms of working with InterSystems in terms of your integration and whatever other software needs you might be meeting with us, in that generally we will help you address a particular use case, but we also give you a lot of technology alongside what you are maybe particularly using. I know many people who are using Iris for Health as an integration engine without necessarily leveraging integrated ML or the analytics capabilities or InterSystems reports. So in the narrows of FHIR, you can start off with some limited FHIR resources that you're working with, build on that as you're moving forward. And in an integration sense and on a data platform sense, you can also say, I'm starting with integration. What other use cases can I build to using Iris for Health? So with that, I will pass along to Steve.
Thanks, Vic. Thank you. So I've deliberately written NHS England and Scotland up there. My team looks after all of our healthcare integration and shared care record customers across the UK and Ireland. But NHS is actually separate organizations in each of those countries. It's not one organization. So I'm going to talk about them separately to an extent. Both are very heavily using FHIR. And in fact, we've been involved in so many projects. My real challenge was deciding which ones to talk about today. So I'm going to start with a couple of success stories. The first one was a project that we actually started about 8 years ago. iCared is a collaborative project between industry and academics in the west of Scotland. So organizations like Keren were working with the NHS and Glasgow University to develop a research platform for AI. And what they wanted to do was get all of the data from the healthcare systems in Glasgow and the surrounding towns and get that all into essentially a warehouse full of NVIDIA GPUs so that they could then make that available for small businesses and academic teams to perform machine learning research and to design algorithms. And so what they wanted us to do was just provide the data. And it was, to be honest, the first time I'd even heard of FHIR, I think. And Keren came to us and said, can you give us FHIR? And of course we can. So we did that. And just to finish that story off, I mean, that system is actively being used now. And earlier this year, the NHS team who are actually running it and maintaining it won a national award for the most successful IT project in Scotland in the last year. So that was really cool. And as another story, in 2020, the National Services team for NHS Scotland decided for some reason that they needed to have a national repository of vaccination information. I don't remember what happened that year, but there was obviously a good reason for that. And they decided to do that with FHIR. And the interesting thing was that from deciding to do that to going live on the actual FHIR service that they built themselves using their technology, I think it was about 6 weeks it took them to build that service. And we got the specification access to their test system from them on a Thursday lunchtime, and by Monday morning we had a live system. So we were connected to their live system. We were sharing the data in HealthShare, in the Unified Care Record, making that data available in TrackCare as well. And again, that system has since been expanded, so it is supporting all of the vaccinations in Scotland. So they've got a single central FHIR service that provides all of the vaccination information for all of the patients in Scotland. And I think the two things to take away from that are, one, FHIR is becoming the global standard as far as I can see from the UK. You know, international organizations come to us and say, we want data, can we have it in FHIR? And where there is political will, where there's that necessity to do things quickly, it's possible to stand things up and connect to them very, very rapidly using FHIR. Now, I'll talk about England, which came to FHIR in a slightly different route. And the problem that the NHS had in England was that England, while small by US standards, is still approaching 60 million patients and really tries to do things at a national level with hundreds of separate organizations all contributing, but there is a big set of national services. And what they found was that legacy organizations, or vendors of legacy applications, systems that had been in use for 20 or 30 years, really didn't have any way to share their data. Our integration engine is in use by more than half of the NHS organizations in England, but if there is no API to connect to, if there isn't a standardized database, there's no ODBC or JDBC, you can't get the data. So what the NHS decided to do was mandate that all services going forward at a national level would be FHIR, and to introduce over a period of time the mandate that any supplier providing software to the NHS had to meet those standards. So as you can see up there, we've got something like 55 FHIR services live across England now, a number of which we've built interfaces for. And we provide those interfaces for both Health Connect, so that organizations can integrate them with our own integration engine, as well as using them in the shared care record. Now, obviously, there were some challenges in that. Some of the suppliers were quite happy to monetize access to the data. They were charging per access to give NHS data back to the NHS. And so they have been somewhat reluctant in their adoption. The performance isn't always great, but we're making a lot of progress and we've got a lot of systems running. And the other challenges we've had have been around managing a mixed estate of multiple versions of FHIR. So we've got, you probably can't see it, but we've got a few DSTU2 services still running. We've got a whole load of STU3, and we've got R4 coming through. And the way it's working at the moment is essentially when we want to move a service to a new version of FHIR, it's effectively an entirely new interface. The old service gets deprecated, the new one gets introduced, and you essentially have to rebuild the integration. So we're working on improving that. And now I'm just going to talk about a couple of those projects we've worked on. So one of the first, and I talked about this actually in a lot more depth, the last global summit I got to come to, which was in Boston in 2019, Digital Child Health Project. Now, on the surface, what this project was about sharing the information about events that happen in the care of young children in the early years of life. So standardized tests, vaccinations, and other events that may or may not happen to children. And instead of having that all in paper and shared between organizations, they wanted to build a publish and subscribe integration to allow this information to be shared, not just between health, but social care, local government, and education, all of the other organizations that needed to see the data. And again, they decided to do that using FHIR, and the real challenge they had, of course, was that children move around. So if a child moves to a different town and goes to a different primary care physician, that doctor doesn't have access to any of the information that was published previously because they weren't subscribed to receive those messages. So what we also built was the FHIR Repository, so that when an organization subscribes to receive messages about the children, they can then also go back and get all of the information about all of the messages that were sent previously. And again, the challenge we had there was about adoption from some of the legacy vendors. So you can see somewhere on that box, I've got the project was really taking place in the northwest of England, a kind of deprived urban area, edging out into the countryside, the national park of the Lake District. And one of the systems there just wasn't new enough, didn't have the support for FHIR. So in terms of the POC that we were working on at this point, we actually connected to a completely separate system, a newer version in London, 300 miles away, just so we could simulate messages going backwards and forwards. But obviously, over a period of time, that became more useful. Another example of a project was about sharing data between neighboring organizations. So one of our shared care records we have in the UK is in the kind of area surrounding Birmingham and the other towns, the green area on the map there. But unfortunately for them, one of the neighboring regions uses a competitor's shared care record. And obviously, there's lots of cross-border patient movement, particularly since that's Birmingham is close to that border, and that's a second largest city in England. So what we wanted to do was share information between those shared care records, and again, we decided to do that using FHIR. So what we started with was building a FHIR repository off the shared care record. So we could make that FHIR repository available to the other organizations. And that was fine, but what we found was that a lot of the data we were getting was from query-on-demand sources, particularly those national services, but also things like social care and child protective services systems tend not to push data out like an EMR might. They were providing a RESTful service or a SOAP service, or in some cases, direct Oracle database queries. So we could only get the data when we needed it, when the patient presented at the organization. So we actually rolled back. I mean, Keren talked before about this idea of going from a FHIR Façade and then putting in a repository. We actually had to go the other way. We took the repository out and built a facade so that we could go and get the data in real time from the Unified Care Record, including all of that on-demand data, convert it to FHIR, and essentially present a facade of a FHIR interface to the other organization, to the other vendor, so that they could query FHIR, but get back that data in real time. And then, of course, the other challenge we had about that was agreeing what data we were going to share. And the latest iteration of this actually is, again, that was a POC. And then what we're doing now is working on that at a national level. So what the NHS has built is a centralized record locator. So we register an endpoint for all of the patients we've got. And then we can provide data for all of the patients in the region and the other regions we serve, wherever it's needed anywhere in the country. Because England is small compared to the US. People move around a lot. That area of Cornwall and Devon in the southwest has a population of about 1 million people during the winter and 20 million in the summer, because everybody goes there on vacation. So it's really important to be able to share that information nationally. And I say we're actually, I've been on vacation myself for the last 2 weeks. We should actually have that system in at least a test environment in the customer data center already, but I haven't checked. So last couple I want to talk about just briefly, and I'm only going to mention them because these aren't live systems yet. They're very early phases, but just to give you an idea of some of the other things we're looking at. One, we have a partner who's working on a POC with a large hospital in London to effectively develop what they call a patient master index. It's a very, very simplified version of an EMPI. Doesn't do any kind of like searching or matching, but what it does allow them to do is, based on the national identifier, actually identify patients across different systems and their local record numbers in those different systems, which they're doing so that they can support then development of mobile applications for patient access. So that's exciting. And another one we're looking at, which is really kind of like, we're only discussing at the moment, but we've got a region that's got 4 separate lab systems, historical pathology systems, with 30 years worth of data. And they're decommissioning those systems and introducing one new universal lab system across the whole region. So what they want to do is take that 30 years of data, shove it into a FHIR repository. They then want to be able to query that, perform analytics on it, and then update it with more data coming from their new systems. So again, we're talking about looking at feeding that into a cloud FHIR server, allowing them access to the query builder, FHIR query builder, so that they can so that they can query it in real time and potentially push that into an OMOP database as well. So again, hopefully that's a project we'll be starting soon. So just to summarize, I think there have been challenges, things that we're working on, that we're improving on, and encouraging adoption across other supply, in particular performance of the system when you've got, in some cases, say 30 years of historical labs data, it's an awful lot of data. So understanding which data you want to get in is important. And I think that's the key thing. I think it was said about in the AI sessions this morning and yesterday, FHIR isn't the reason that you're doing it. You should not be setting out saying, we want to use FHIR, what can we do with FHIR? What you should be starting with is those use cases, and then thinking, is FHIR the right way to do that? And I believe there is a good chance it will be, but you need to know what you want to achieve, not just that you want to use FHIR. But I say, from my perspective, at least in the UK, FHIR is the standard. It sounds like the same is true in Israel, and I know in other territories. It seems like it's becoming much more prevalent in the US as well. And where there is the political and technical will to do it, it can be done very quickly and very easily, particularly if you're fortunate enough to use InterSystems, FHIR technology and integration services. And I think that's all I have to say. We did have a slide that talks about other sessions on FHIR, most of which have already happened, I think. Oh, there's some more. So there are some more sessions this afternoon. If you want to take a note of those, I'd definitely encourage you to go, and I'm certainly going to a couple of them myself. And of course, please leave feedback using the app, or if you want to look at some of the technology that we're developing and sign up for the early access program, there's a barcode there. And hopefully I've left at least a few minutes for questions if anybody has any. Yeah, sure.
You mentioned a couple of times that you decide what to put in your FHIR repository and so on. But don't you come across usually, since it's an interoperability project, to implementation guides, profile, compliance?
Yes.
That's where it should start from normally, or?
Well, yeah, and that's a really good point. I showed you, there's, at least in the UK, Keren can talk about Israel, but we've got 55 live services. Each one of those actually has its own separate profile based on the UK core standard. So it really depends what the service is about. Obviously, the vaccination service, vaccinations are a mandatory resource, whereas in other services they may not be. But then in a project where we're just trying to share as much data as we can, everything we've got with neighboring regions, then we share everything. So you're right, you're quite right. Each individual service might have a different set of data, and it's not always us who decides what that is. It's a big room, I can't see everybody at once, so if I'm missing a hand, there you go.
There's any sort of upper limit to the type of project that a FHIR Façade can handle as opposed to a full FHIR?
I think it depends on your backend systems. How much can they absorb, or how fast they can get information. If it's already at the top of their capacity, you're just going to overload them with extra access, okay? So you need to balance it, especially if those are operational systems, okay? So if those are backend systems that get information all the time and there are like 30% usage or something like that, they can go from there. But if they're their top capacity and those are functional systems that the whole hospital, for example, is using, you need to bear in mind that you're going to overload them, okay? So Façade might not be the option to go over there.
And again, I think that comes down to looking at what data is needed. So one of the interfaces we have in the UK is what we call GP Connect, gets data in real time from primary care systems. Mm-hmm. And what we initially said was, well, what the customer wanted, what the NHS wanted was to get everything. Mm-hmm. And what we found was it didn't impact the actual operation of the system, but for patients who'd been on the same solution for 30 years, in some cases, there was just such a vast amount of data that it was taking minutes for their system to put together the data that we could then get back. Because we were talking, they were sending us a couple hundred megabytes of data about a patient. And Once we got that data, converting it and making use of it was a couple of seconds. But the fact is that if a user's sitting there at the screen and having to wait 5 minutes for the data to come back in the first place, they don't care whether it's our bit that's slow or their bit that's slow. They just know it's taking too long. So in that case, what we had to do was look and say, well, okay, which information do we want? We only really want information about encounters and visits and diagnoses for the last 2 years, but maybe we want information about allergies going back 30 years, but for pathology and lab results, we only need the last 6 months. And we have to kind of make those decisions. What information do you need? Not just always give me everything and we'll just handle it, because as you say, sometimes it's just too much. Ted.
So I'm curious, when you develop a facade with FHIR data, how do you eliminate people?
Major question, yeah.
Well, so what we've got in the case in Birmingham, I mean, I say we, it was Pat McGibbon's team actually built it, not me. But what we've got there is essentially we've got the Unified Care Record and Patient Index there. So we receive, we take in the FHIR request with a patient ID, and it'll be the NHS number, which is National Identifier. And then using Patient Index and the UCR, we go and then get all of the rest of the data as SDA, convert that to FHIR with the transforms and blast it back. The MPI system that one of our partners is building in London, I mentioned, again, what they've done is they've been working with our product development team, and they're actually using that NHS number as the FHIR identifier rather than letting the repository generate the number. So then they don't have to round trip. Yeah. They don't have to query to find the patient and then query again to get the data. They can do it in one go. Well, if anybody does have any more questions, feel free to grab whichever of us you think is appropriate. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.